Our services this month have considered the matter of spiritual practices. As our student minister Christina Hockman explained last Sunday, just about any activity could be a spiritual practice, so long as that activity is undertaken with intentionality, regularity, and depth. It certainly need not be a conventional religious activity such as prayer or meditation or reading scripture. And for that matter, it's quite possible to pray, meditate, and read scripture without there being anything particularly spiritual about them. But if activities as diverse as yoga, music, painting, quilting, gardening, even washing the dishes are approached with intentionality, regularity, and depth, then they can be considered spiritual practices. And as Chris concluded last week, chances are you're already doing something in your life that could be your spiritual practice, or maybe it actually is your spiritual practice without you even realizing it. After all, what makes it a spiritual practice isn't the activity itself. There's nothing magical about any of those activities that I just named. Rather, it's doing them intentionally, regularly, and deeply that makes them spiritual practices rather than merely casual hobbies. So at the beginning of the month, for instance, I talked about our 7 principles, specifically studying them, understanding them, and remembering them as a way to engage more deeply with our faith as Unitarian Universalists. Do that with intentionality, regularity, and depth, and you have yourself a spiritual practice. Or 2 weeks ago, I talked about interpersonal boundaries as key to healthy relationships, something that if we're going to do even reasonably well, really requires ongoing mindfulness and care, which makes it a shoo-in as a spiritual practice. So with Thanksgiving coming up this week, let's consider something that for most of us happens with some regularity, but often without intentionality and rarely with any depth, and that's eating. It's just so easy for eating a meal not to be a spiritual activity. We look to food to provide us with nourishment, and sometimes not even a particularly high quality of nourishment, just something to fill our bellies as we rush from one meeting or class or appointment or task to the next, often at the same time as we're trying to squeeze in something else that needs to be done. And I'm not just talking about eating in front of the television, which these days barely registers on anybody's list of bad habits. But how many of you, and I won't embarrass you by asking for a show of hands, how many of you have ever eaten food while reading something that you had to study? Have you ever been eating while talking to someone else on the telephone? Have you ever eaten a meal while driving? Distracted driving can obviously have deadly consequences, but distracted eating isn't particularly healthy for us either. For one thing, our bodies have evolved certain ways of processing food, and many modern dietary habits are at odds with those. Then there's the fact that our attitudes towards food are pretty integral to our sense of our own identity. Just ask any vegetarian how often it's happened that they've merely mentioned the fact that they don't eat meat, and suddenly everyone around them becomes an evangelist for bacon. And then there's the social side of food, which has a huge impact on religious community too. As Donald Skinner noted in his UU World article entitled Feeding the Spirit, we Unitarian Universalists love food as much as we love our coffee. We have potlucks, circle suppers, Sunday brunches, community gardens, seders, and Sunday school snacks. We work in soup kitchens, sell our dinners at the church auction, hold second Sunday sit-downs. Where is our holy church, Skinner asks? One place is in the kitchen. Skinner goes on to describe how Paint Branch UU in Adelphi, Maryland, raised the money to complete the kitchen in their new building through a series of dinners that also provided opportunities for people to learn about other cultures. Then there was Dana Bjorklund, president of the UU Society of Cleveland, Ohio at the time, who found herself living one of the consequences of leadership when no one else is willing to show up, in this case cleaning out the congregation's increasingly ripe refrigerator. Only then, because a guy named Ed did show up to help with that truly disgusting task, Bjorklund's faith was deepened by the visible sign of Ed's commitment to the congregation. And at the Quimper UU Fellowship in Port Townsend, Washington, Betty Oppenheimer found herself cooking 30 pounds of salmon outside in the midst of a windstorm and a power failure. And that apparently proved something important because they elected her to the search committee for a new minister. Do you think there's a connection between food and trust? Oppenheimer asks. But whether we're talking about community meals like today's soup social, or the meals our volunteers serve to needy people at St. Paul's or Port, or meals for Thanksgiving or other holidays with family and friends, or even ordinary everyday meals with others or by yourself, there are always ways to bring not just intentionality, but particularly depth to this regular activity. And it starts simply enough. As nutritionist with a master's degree in the psychology of eating, Mark David puts it, be there when you eat. Achieve the fullest experience of your food. Taste it. Savor it. Pay attention to it. Rejoice in it. In other words, when eating, actually be present to the fact that you are eating, and make it the focus of your consciousness with every bite you take. Of course, beyond basic mindfulness, there are some traditionally religious approaches to mealtime. As UU Minister Aaron Payson explains in his essay on the subject, eating is a sacred act, which is why in most religious traditions, mealtime is made distinct from other activities by beginning with a time of grace or blessing, so that those gathered to partake of the sustenance before them might be mindful of their connection to each other, to the environment, and to that which is holy around them and within them. Payson goes on to quote what some Zen monks say to themselves before eating their meals in silence. I reflect on the work of others, which brings this food to me. I reflect on my imperfections and whether I am deserving of this food. I take this food as a medicine to keep my body in good health. I accept this food so that I will fulfill my task of enlightenment. Most mealtime graces that I've heard in Unitarian Universalist circles include words of gratitude not just for the food itself, but for its origins and preparation too. From the sunlight and the rain that allow plants to grow, to the people who sow, harvest, cook, serve, and clean up as well. That's one way that we deepen our awareness of the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, as our seventh principle puts it. We don't necessarily get specific about who those people are and where they live, though. So let me offer you one example, not just for breakfast, but for an entire morning routine, as articulated by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963. When we arise in the morning, we go into the bathroom where we reach for a sponge provided for us by a Pacific Islander. We reach for soap that is created for us by a Frenchman. The towel is provided by a Turk. Then at the table we drink coffee, which is provided for us by a South American, or tea by a Chinese, or cocoa by a West African. Before we leave for our jobs, we are beholden to more than half the world. The specifics may be different in 2015, though, if anything, they're more complicated now. Our material amenities and breakfast foods and beverages even more globalized than they were 52 years ago. So Dr. King's point remains. We are everlasting debtors to known and unknown men and women. And not just women and men here in this country, but all around the world. So as we prepare to celebrate this nation's primary holiday, a holiday that is centered more than any other around a meal, it's one of the reasons why much of the current reaction to violence around the world is particularly disturbing. What's happened recently in Paris, Lebanon, Baghdad, Nigeria and Mali is awful and should certainly horrify us. But the open hostility to Syrian refugees is horrible too, while the overt demonization of Muslims is simply unforgivable. Apparently, Congress has forgotten about the sickening images of the bodies of dead children washing up on beaches because their families were so desperate to escape from the hell that their country has turned into. And you can't call for refugees to prove they're Christian to be admitted, or for Muslim places of worship to be shut down, and still claim to support the Constitution too, assuming that by the Constitution they mean more than just the Second Amendment. As for any person calling themselves a candidate for the office of president who says that all Muslims, including American citizens, should be tracked in a national database and carry specific identification cards, well, it's all too easy to invoke fascism in talking about politicians we consider extreme. But good God, did we learn nothing from the Holocaust? Of course, such outrageous declarations go hand in hand with, and in many ways are fueled by, the microaggressions that are committed against Muslims as well as other minorities on a daily basis. Dalia Moghahed, co-author of Who Speaks for Islam, experienced such a microaggression this week when she was asked by NBC's Chuck Todd why Muslims haven't done more to speak out against Islamic terrorists. Here's what Moghahed said in response. I think we should take a step back and ask a different question. Is it justified to demand that Muslims condemn terrorism? That might sound a little radical, just even asking it. The reason I say that is this. Condoning the killing of civilians is to me about the most monstrous thing you can do. And to be suspected of doing something so monstrous simply because of your faith seems very unfair. Now, when you look at the majority of terrorist attacks in the United States, according to the FBI, Moghahed continues, the majority of domestic terrorist attacks are actually committed by white male Christians. That's just the facts. When those things occur, we don't suspect other people who share their faith and ethnicity of condoning them. We assume that these things outrage them just as much as they do anyone else. And you have to afford that same assumption of innocence to Muslims. For our human community, UUA past President Jean Pickett wrote in his prayer, for our common past and future hope, our oneness transcending all separation, our capacity to work for peace and justice in the midst of hostility and oppression, we give thanks this day. The thing about prayer is that it's really for the person who's doing the praying. There's no magic to it. So following the terrorist attacks in Paris, I wasn't praying for Paris. I was praying for us, for me. I was praying that I not give in to fear. Because that's the whole point of terrorism, to make us terrified. We can be sickened, we can be horrified, that's okay, that's human. But we can't be terrified. And so for high hopes and noble causes, for faith without fanaticism, for understanding of views not shared, we give thanks this day. There's a long-standing tradition when it comes to the Passover Seder to set an extra place at the table. Some say that it's for the prophet Elijah, while others say that it's to remind us of the people who aren't with us, or to have a place available if there should be an unexpected guest. But that's not a practice that's necessarily confined or unique to a Passover Seder. UU Minister Aaron Payson remembers that his mother would usually set an extra place at the dinner table, and on many evenings it would end up being filled by an unexpected visitor. For Payson's family, practicing hospitality was important, reminding them all that in many parts of the world, being invited to a stranger's table and learning to receive the gift of food often meant the difference between life and death. Especially at Thanksgiving, when we express gratitude for the abundant gifts that have blessed our lives, making space at the table for the stranger, for the unexpected guest, making space at the national table for the refugee, is the best expression of gratitude that we can make. That's why the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee asks UU congregations to begin the annual Guest at Your Table program around Thanksgiving. Many of you have been part of this in previous years, so you know how it used to work. You took home one of these little boxes, you put it on your dinner table, and every time you sat down for a meal, you saw the box there on your table, and you remembered to put a few coins or even a couple of dollar bills into it. For many people, it was a way of extending the blessings for which they were grateful to the stranger, to the unexpected guest. But a couple of years ago, the UU Service Committee didn't make these little boxes. After all, producing thousands of these and printing them all in full colour, only for them to be used for a couple of months before they go, hopefully, into the recycling bin, well, that's not really in keeping with many congregations' commitment to be green sanctuaries. So Joanne and I thought about it. We recognised the value of the physical presence of the cardboard box on the dinner table, and we came up with our own UUFP way to do Guest at Your Table. After all, everything that UU World writer Donald Skinner wrote about food applies to us here. We enjoy eating together, whether it's a potluck or a lunch after services at a local restaurant, or a meal for 6 or 8 offered as an auction item, or a special dinner as part of the annual pledge drive. Members of this congregation covenant to companion one another on this journey of the Spirit that we call life. And there's nothing wrong with remembering that to be a companion literally means to share bread with someone. Now, as Joanne mentioned earlier, we do have a few people here who can't eat gluten, but the good news is that there's always plenty more food than just bread here. Today, for instance, is a fourth Sunday, and that means that the membership committee is hosting one of the soup socials that run on fourth Sundays through the winter months. These aren't potlucks, but rather the membership committee and other devoted volunteers provide a variety of types of soup and an occasional chili that are available for anyone to enjoy. In keeping with our own efforts to be good stewards of the environment, you're encouraged to bring your own bowl and spoon, but you won't be turned away if you didn't. After all, everyone is welcome to join in without having to bring anything except for their willingness to help out with setting up tables and chairs or taking them down afterwards. Oh, and bringing your appetite, of course. Then there's the Thanksgiving Day potluck that Sandra Engelhardt is coordinating right here this Thursday for what I believe is the 9th year in a row. If you'd otherwise be by yourself for Thanksgiving, or even if you'll be with others who might also enjoy a friendly meal with a welcoming group, then you're welcome to come. Just let Sandra know today. In a similar vein, the Festival of the Season that we're doing for the 3rd year here on December 5th will kick off the afternoon's festivities with a meal as well. And there are also many regular groups and programs that include potlucks or meals together in their activities. And looking out as far ahead as the spring, the afternoon of April 23rd will hold a Passover Seder, another religious practice of companionship. So thinking about all these opportunities we have to share food together, Joanne and I very quickly realized that instead of the little collection boxes that go home with each of you for guests at your table, then instead we could have one big collection box that stays here at the fellowship as a guest at our table. So look for this box. Look for this guest at our table box at those lunches and potlucks and dinners I mentioned, probably on the kitchen island where the food is usually served, and this will be the guest at our table. Putting some coins or dollar bills or anything into the box is, of course, voluntary. We don't charge admission to any of these meals. They're not church fundraisers, and the soup socials aren't even potlucks. And in fact, some of our own members who face daily financial hardships come to such events specifically for a meal that they might not otherwise get. And it's great that we can make that possible. But we also have plenty of people who are able to put anything from loose pocket change to a $20 bill into this box, and being sure to be grateful for all of their blessings, will want to do so. It'll add up, and come the spring, we'll send it to the UU Service Committee, helping to support their work advancing human rights around the world, particularly with people and communities who are denied their rights because of who they are: women, people of colour, religious minorities, and others who are not served by mainstream human rights organisations. Having a guest at our table is just one expression of our commitments to justice and compassion, emphasising as well that what we do as Unitarian Universalists, we do together in community and not only as individuals. So this Thanksgiving, however you will be spending the day, when it comes time to eat, I encourage you to think beyond the nourishment of the food itself, to spend some time giving thanks for the miracle of life we share with all beings. Think of how your meal connects you to people and places all around the world, and think of your gratitude to them. Think of those seeking refuge from hostility and oppression, and think of what you might do to be part of bringing them peace and justice. So may it be.